The echoes of history are growing louder, and the world is watching as the United States weighs an unprecedented decision. For the first time since the fall of apartheid, South African politicians could face direct sanctions from Washington, a move that signals a major shift in US-Africa relations. But what's driving this sudden policy change? Is this a calculated revival of Trump-era foreign policy strategies, or a response to deeper geopolitical tensions brewing beneath the surface? As diplomatic ties strain and accusations fly, one question looms large. Is the US using economic leverage to hold South Africa accountable, or is this just another chapter in a broader global power struggle? Stay with us as we break down the political maneuvers, historical context, and potential fallout of this explosive development. A diplomatic earthquake in the making. For the first time since the fall of apartheid, the United States is weighing sanctions on South African politicians, an unprecedented move that has ignited debates across the global political spectrum. With Washington revisiting a hardline approach reminiscent of the Trump administration, the implications stretch far beyond diplomatic tensions. At the heart of this issue is a tangled web of foreign policy, ideological battles, and economic interests. As the Biden administration contemplates its next steps, the world is watching closely. Will these potential sanctions mark a return to aggressive American foreign policy, or are they a necessary measure to address corruption and human rights violations? A flashback to Trump-era sanction strategy. During his presidency, Donald Trump took an assertive stance on foreign policy, embracing economic and political sanctions as a key tool to advance American interests. His administration frequently leveraged the Global Magnitsky Act to punish individuals and entities involved in corruption, human rights abuses, and political instability. Countries such as China, Venezuela, and Iran bore the brunt of these sanctions, with leaders facing visa restrictions, asset freezes, and trade penalties. The philosophy behind these moves was simple: apply maximum pressure to force compliance. Now, with South Africa in Washington's crosshairs, it appears that elements of Trump's approach are being resurrected. The question is, why now, and why South Africa? Why is South Africa suddenly a target? For decades, South Africa has maintained a relatively stable relationship with the United States. While occasional disagreements have surfaced, diplomatic ties have largely remained intact. However, recent developments suggest a shift in Washington's stance, with US officials now considering sanctions against Pretoria. This potential move marks a significant turning point in bilateral relations. So, what changed? South Africa's alignment with Russia and China. One of the primary concerns driving Washington's reconsideration of its relationship with South Africa is Pretoria's growing alignment with Russia and China. As a member of BRICS, a coalition of emerging economies including Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, Pretoria has strengthened ties with nations that often challenge Western dominance. The US views this shift with increasing suspicion, especially as BRICS seeks to establish alternative financial systems that could reduce reliance on the US dollar. More troubling for Washington is South Africa's stance on the war in Ukraine. Unlike many Western allies, Pretoria has refused to condemn Russia's invasion and has instead pursued a policy of non-alignment. In addition, South Africa's recent joint military exercises with Russia and China have raised alarms in Washington, reinforcing concerns that Pretoria is moving away from its traditional Western partnerships. These actions suggest a geopolitical realignment that may directly conflict with US interests in Africa. Corruption and human rights concerns. Another factor contributing to the strained relationship is the growing perception that South Africa's governance is deteriorating. Several South African politicians have been implicated in large-scale corruption scandals, including allegations of state capture, where private interests exert undue influence over government institutions. Corruption has weakened public trust in the government and hindered economic growth, further destabilizing the nation. Additionally, human rights violations and concerns over press freedom have drawn criticism from international watchdogs. The US has historically been vocal about issues related to democracy and governance, and the perceived erosion of democratic institutions in South Africa has fueled tensions. Washington sees political instability in Pretoria as a potential risk, not just for South Africa, but for regional security as well. Economic and trade implications. Despite these concerns, South Africa remains a significant economic partner for the United States. The two nations share strong trade ties, particularly in the mining and energy sectors. South Africa is a major exporter of key minerals such as platinum, gold, and rare earth elements, resources that are critical to global supply chains, including those in the U.S. The potential imposition of sanctions raises serious economic questions. Trade restrictions could disrupt business operations for both American and South African companies, leading to financial losses on both sides. The uncertainty surrounding potential sanctions has already led to speculation about how U.S. businesses with interests in South Africa might be affected. If economic ties weaken, South Africa may look further toward China and Russia for trade and investment, accelerating the very shift Washington hopes to prevent. A shift in U.S. strategy toward Africa. The Biden administration's consideration of sanctions signals a broader shift in America's approach to Africa. Unlike previous decades, where economic and diplomatic engagement defined U.S.-Africa relations, Washington now appears more willing to use punitive measures to influence political developments on the continent. This approach aligns with broader geopolitical trends, where the U.S. is seeking to counter Chinese and Russian influence in Africa. Ultimately, the decision to impose sanctions on South Africa is not just about Pretoria's actions, it is about the evolving nature of global power dynamics. As tensions between the West and BRICS nations continue to rise, the U.S. must carefully navigate its relationship with South Africa to avoid pushing the country further into the arms of its geopolitical rivals. Sanctions, a tool or a weapon. Historically, sanctions have been used as both a diplomatic tool and a political weapon. Their effectiveness, however, has often been debated. The case for sanctions. Supporters of sanctions argue that they are essential to holding corrupt leaders accountable and preventing further democratic backsliding. Without consequences, they warn that politicians accused of corruption and misconduct will continue to exploit their positions, undermining governance and stability. For Washington, imposing sanctions would send a clear message that the U.S. will not tolerate South Africa's deepening ties with authoritarian regimes. This move would reinforce America's stance on democracy and human rights while discouraging further alignment with global powers like China and Russia. Additionally, sanctions would serve to protect American interests by maintaining U.S. geopolitical influence in Africa and preventing rival nations from expanding their foothold. Lastly, advocates believe that economic restrictions could pressure South Africa's leadership to implement stronger democratic institutions and anti-corruption measures, ensuring greater transparency and accountability in governance. For these reasons, many argue that sanctions are a necessary tool in shaping South Africa's political trajectory. The case against sanctions. Critics warn that imposing sanctions on South Africa could have unintended consequences, potentially harming ordinary citizens more than the politicians they target. Economically, trade restrictions could further weaken South Africa's already struggling economy, exacerbating unemployment and poverty. Diplomatically, sanctions may push South Africa closer to China and Russia, strengthening alliances that could diminish U.S. influence in the region. Beyond the immediate impact, some argue that such actions set a dangerous precedent for U.S. overreach. They contend that Washington should not interfere in the domestic affairs of sovereign nations unless there is a direct threat to national security. This debate extends beyond South Africa, raising broader questions about America's role in global governance. Should the U.S. prioritize enforcing democratic values abroad, or should it focus on strategic partnerships without intervening in domestic politics? The decision will have lasting implications for U.S. foreign policy and global power dynamics. Biden's dilemma: to sanction or not to sanction? President Joe Biden now faces a difficult choice as pressure mounts over U.S. policy toward South Africa. While his administration has distanced itself from Trump-era policies, the growing calls for action make it increasingly difficult to remain neutral. Any decision Biden makes will have significant implications for U.S. foreign policy, particularly in Africa, where China and Russia are strengthening their influence. Domestic pressure from Congress. Within the U.S., lawmakers are divided on how to handle the situation. Some members of Congress are pushing for firm action, arguing that South Africa's government is undermining democratic institutions and should face consequences. They believe that failing to act would send the wrong message about America's commitment to democracy and human rights. However, others caution against taking a hardline stance, warning that alienating a key African ally could backfire. With China rapidly expanding its investments and influence across the continent, cutting ties with South Africa could further push Pretoria into Beijing's orbit. This division in Congress reflects broader debates within the U.S. foreign policy establishment about how best to compete with China in Africa. International backlash. If the U.S. moves forward with sanctions, the international response could be swift and severe. South Africa is unlikely to remain passive and could retaliate diplomatically, potentially limiting cooperation with the U.S. on key regional and global issues. Other African nations may also see sanctions as an example of neo-colonial interference, reinforcing suspicions that Western powers still seek to dictate African affairs. Such a move could damage America's credibility and weaken its diplomatic standing in the region. Furthermore, China and Russia would likely capitalize on this rift, deepening their ties with South Africa and other African nations that share concerns over Western interventionism. A compromise approach. Given these risks, Biden may seek a middle ground approach that balances pressure with engagement. Instead of imposing full-scale sanctions, the U.S. could opt for targeted measures against specific individuals within South Africa's leadership while maintaining broader diplomatic and economic relations. This approach would send a clear signal without entirely severing ties. Economic and security cooperation could continue, preventing a complete breakdown in relations and preserving U.S. influence in the region. With the stakes so high, Biden must carefully navigate this geopolitical minefield. Any misstep could have far-reaching consequences, not only for U.S.-South Africa relations, but also for America's broader strategy in Africa. The global reaction: allies and adversaries take sides. As the U.S. considers imposing sanctions on South Africa, global powers are closely monitoring the situation. Any punitive action could reshape international alliances and geopolitical dynamics. China and Russia, strengthening ties with South Africa. Both Beijing and Moscow have seized the opportunity to deepen economic and political ties with Pretoria, capitalizing on rising tensions between the U.S. and South Africa. China has already invested billions in South Africa's infrastructure, energy, and mining sectors, positioning itself as a dominant economic partner. If sanctions are imposed, Beijing could expand its influence even further, filling the economic void left by Washington. Meanwhile, Russia sees South Africa as a key strategic ally in its broader efforts to counter Western dominance. Moscow's military and security cooperation with Pretoria may intensify, potentially leading to increased arms deals and deeper collaboration on defense initiatives. The European Union, a more cautious approach. Unlike the US, the European Union is expected to take a more measured approach, prioritizing economic and diplomatic stability. The EU remains one of South Africa's largest trading partners, making outright sanctions unlikely. European leaders may instead focus on diplomatic engagement, seeking to mediate between Washington and Pretoria to prevent further escalation. By balancing pressure with dialogue, the EU could attempt to maintain its influence while avoiding the economic and political fallout of direct punitive measures. African Union, defending sovereignty. Across the continent, many African leaders view potential US sanctions as an infringement on South Africa's sovereignty. The African Union, AU, is likely to rally behind Pretoria, reinforcing regional solidarity against what it perceives as Western interference. Additionally, other African nations fear that punitive actions against South Africa could set a dangerous precedent, making them vulnerable to similar measures in the future. This broader resistance could further strain Africa's relations with the West, pushing the continent closer to alternative global powers. With multiple global players involved, the consequences of U.S. sanctions on South Africa could extend far beyond bilateral relations, reshaping the balance of power on the world stage. What happens next? The road ahead. As the Biden administration weighs potential actions against South Africa, several key factors will shape its final decision. South Africa's response. The stance of South African leaders will be crucial. If Pretoria takes meaningful steps to combat corruption and alleviate concerns about its foreign alliances, the U.S. may refrain from imposing sanctions. However, a defiant or dismissive approach from South African officials could push Washington towards stronger measures. The U.S. will closely monitor whether South Africa aligns with Western interests or deepens ties with nations viewed as adversarial to American foreign policy. Congressional action. The U.S. Congress will play a significant role in shaping policy. Lawmakers, particularly in a divided political climate, will debate the merits of imposing sanctions. Bipartisan divisions will influence the final decision, with some advocating for strict measures to uphold democratic values and others warning against alienating a key African partner. Congressional hearings, testimonies from experts, and lobbying efforts from both sides will all contribute to the evolving stance on South Africa. Diplomatic negotiations. Diplomacy remains a potential pathway to avoiding full-scale sanctions. Behind-the-scenes negotiations between Washington and Pretoria could yield compromises that satisfy both nations. U.S. diplomats may push for policy adjustments rather than punitive measures, leveraging economic and strategic interests to reach an agreement. Regardless of the final decision, this moment represents a turning point in U.S.-South Africa relations. It highlights the broader debate over the effectiveness of sanctions, the limits of American influence, and the evolving nature of global alliances. The outcome will serve as a test case for Washington's ability to balance strategic interests with democratic principles in an increasingly multipolar world. A defining moment in U.S.-Africa relations. The potential sanctions on South African politicians represent a dramatic shift in foreign policy, reminiscent of Trump-era tactics. Whether Biden follows through or chooses a different path, this moment will leave a lasting impact on America's engagement with Africa. As the world watches, one thing is clear. This isn't just about South Africa. It's about the future of global power dynamics and how the U.S. positions itself in an increasingly multipolar world. The decisions made in Washington today could redefine America's role on the world stage for years to come. Will these measures push South Africa closer to alternative allies like Russia and China? Will this reignite anti-Western sentiments in Africa? Or is this a necessary step to uphold democratic values and human rights? The stakes are high and the world is watching. Let us know in the comments. Do you think the U.S. is justified in considering these sanctions? Or is this another case of political overreach? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth global analysis. Until next time, stay informed, stay critical, and keep questioning the world around you.